The morning my son-in-law handed me a folder and told me to sign it, I noticed his hands were shaking. Not from nerves, from excitement. That's the part I keep coming back to. He wasn't nervous about what he was asking me to do. He was excited about what he thought was about to happen. I didn't sign it. I set it down on the kitchen table, poured myself a second cup of coffee, and looked out the window at the oak tree in the backyard. My late wife Margaret planted that tree 31 years ago. It was about 6 inches tall when she put it in the ground. Now it's taller than the house. I said, "Let me read through this tonight." He smiled and said, "Of course, Walter. Take your time." I knew right then that something was very wrong. My name is Walter Calloway. I'm 67 years old. I spent 38 years building a commercial real estate business in Charlotte, North Carolina. I started with nothing, one small strip mall in a neighborhood nobody wanted, a loan I wasn't sure I could pay back, and a wife who believed in me more than I believed in myself. By the time I was 55, I owned 11 properties across 3 states. By the time Margaret passed, 4 years ago, I had quietly sold most of them, consolidated everything, and structured my assets in a way that very few people knew about, including my daughter. My daughter's name is Renee. She's 41. She married a man named Derek 6 years ago. Derek is a financial consultant. He wears very expensive watches and talks about money the way some men talk about sports constantly, confidently, and often incorrectly. When Renee first brought him home for Thanksgiving, he spent 20 minutes explaining to me why I should refinance my primary residence. I nodded politely and changed the subject. I didn't tell him that I hadn't carried a mortgage in 14 years. I also have a son. His name is Paul. He's 38, lives in Denver, works in environmental engineering. Paul calls me every Sunday. He came home when Margaret got sick and stayed for 3 weeks without being asked. He's not part of this story the way Renee and Derek are. But he matters. He matters a lot. For the first 2 years after Margaret passed, Renee was attentive and kind. She called regularly. She invited me to dinners. She and Derek came to Charlotte twice to visit. I was grateful. Grief is a strange thing. It makes you cling to whoever is standing nearby. I was standing near Renee, and she seemed to be standing near me. Then the conversations started to shift. It was subtle at first. Small comments. Derek asking me questions about my portfolio over dinner. Renee mentioning, casually, that their financial situation was a little stretched because of the house they'd bought in Raleigh. Derek saying, once, with a laugh that wasn't quite a laugh, "Walter, you really should let me take a look at how everything's structured. I see a lot of older guys sitting on assets that aren't working hard enough." I smiled and said I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. Then, about 18 months ago, the conversations stopped being subtle. Renee called me on a Tuesday afternoon and told me she and Derek wanted to come visit for a long weekend. I said, "Of course, I'd love that." They arrived on Friday. We had a nice dinner. On Saturday morning, Derek sat across from me at the breakfast table and slid a piece of paper toward me. It was a proposal, typed, formatted, with a header that read, "Calloway Family Asset Optimization Plan." I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at Derek. He explained it calmly. The basic idea was that I would transfer ownership of my primary residence, a 5-bedroom home in Myers Park, appraised at around $2.1 million, into an LLC. The LLC would be jointly managed by Derek and me. This would, he explained, protect the asset and streamline estate planning. He used the phrase streamline estate planning 4 times in about 6 minutes. I asked him who drafted the document. He said he had a colleague who was an attorney. I asked what the colleague's name was. He gave me a name. I wrote it down. That night, after Renee and Derek went to bed, I sat in my study and made some calls. I have a real attorney. His name is Gerald Fitzpatrick. He's been my attorney for 22 years. I sent Gerald a photo of the document. His response came back in 40 minutes. He said, "Walter, this document would give Derek effective control over the LLC within 18 months through a clause buried in Section 4. Do not sign this. And we need to talk." I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I told Derek I needed more time to review the paperwork. He said, "Of course." He smiled the same smile as before. Renee made pancakes, We talked about their dog and a vacation they were planning. Nobody mentioned the document again. They left Sunday afternoon, and Derek shook my hand at the door and said, "I really think this is going to be great for the whole family, Walter." I said, "I'll be in touch." I called Gerald first thing Monday morning. What Gerald told me over the next few weeks fundamentally changed how I understood what was happening. The document Derek had given me was not the only thing in motion. Gerald had done some digging. He'd spoken to a contact who knew Derek's legal colleague. There was a broader plan, and it was more serious than a problematic LLC structure. Derek had been consulting with an elder law attorney, not to protect me, but to explore the possibility of a guardianship petition. They were building a case, however thin, that I was not fully capable of managing my own affairs. They had documented 2 instances where I had apparently exhibited confusion, one of which was a phone call where I had allegedly mixed up dates, and another was a conversation at a family dinner where I had, according to Derek's version, seemed disoriented. I have no memory of being disoriented at any dinner. What I remember is that I had been tired that evening and left early. Gerald said to me, "Walter, this is not an accident. This is a strategy." I sat with that for a long moment. Then I asked Gerald what I needed to do. He told me, "I want to be honest about how I felt during this period, because I think it matters. I was not angry, exactly, or rather, the anger was there, but it was underneath something else. What I felt most was a kind of grief. Not the grief I had felt when Margaret died. That grief was devastating, but it was clean. This was a different kind. This was the grief of looking at your daughter across a dinner table and understanding, fully and completely, that she has made a choice. That she is looking at you and seeing something to be acquired. That the phone calls and the visits and the pancakes on Sunday morning were, at least in part, a transaction. I don't know at what point Renee fully joined what Derek was doing. I don't know if she was the initiator or if she was persuaded into it slowly. I've thought about this a great deal. What I've concluded is that it doesn't matter as much as I once thought it did. The participation was the thing, the knowing and the continuing. I called Paul. This was not a difficult decision. Paul is my son, and I trust him completely. I also needed someone in my corner who understood what was at stake. I told him everything: the document, Gerald's findings, the guardianship research. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Paul said very quietly, "Dad, I'm coming home." I told him to wait. I told him I had a plan, and that the best thing he could do right now was stay in Denver and act completely normal if Renee called him. He didn't like this, but he agreed. Gerald and I spent the next several weeks executing what he had been recommending for years. I had already done significant estate planning after Margaret's passing, more than Renee or Derek knew about, but there were still pieces that needed to be restructured to be fully protected. Gerald coordinated with my financial advisors. We moved assets. We formalized trusts. We made sure that every significant piece of my estate was structured in a way that was completely, legally, irrevocably beyond the reach of any guardianship proceeding or any claim of incapacity. There was one property that required particular attention. In addition to my home in Myers Park, I owned a lakefront property on Lake Norman about 40 minutes north of Charlotte. I had bought it 15 years ago as a family retreat. Margaret and I had spent summers there. The kids had grown up swimming off the dock. It was appraised now at approximately $1.4 million. Renee believed, for reasons I had never corrected, that this property would come to her someday. She had mentioned it in passing several times over the years, the lake house, always in a tone that suggested an assumption of future ownership. She had even, once, described it to a friend as the lake house that's going to be mine eventually. I heard this secondhand from a family friend who had been at the same gathering. The lake house was the second piece of the puzzle. 2 months after Derek had slid that document across my breakfast table, I received a certified letter. It was from Derek's colleague, the attorney. It was formal notification that a petition for limited guardianship over my person and estate was being filed in Mecklenburg County. I read the letter, standing at my front door. Then I walked to my study, sat down, and called Gerald. Gerald said, "We're ready." The guardianship petition was based on extremely thin material. The alleged incidents of confusion A note from a doctor I had seen once, years ago, for a routine physical, which Derek's attorney was attempting to characterize as indicating cognitive concerns, a characterization my own physicians flatly rejected in writing. Gerald had already prepared counter-documentation. 3 doctors, colleagues I had seen regularly, all providing detailed assessments of my full cognitive and decision-making capacity. Friends, business associates, Paul, prepared to testify. But here's the thing about a legal fight that most people don't fully appreciate until they're in one. Even when you're going to win, the process costs you something. Time, energy, dignity. The act of having to prove that you are not confused, that you are not declining, that you are a competent adult. It takes something from you. Every document filed is another reminder of what was done. So Gerald and I had discussed not just how to win the legal fight, we had discussed how to make the legal fight unnecessary. I called Renee the morning after I received the certified letter. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was careful. I said, "I got Derek's attorney's letter." She said, "Dad, we're just worried about you. We want to make sure you're protected." I said, "I understand." She said, "We just think it would be better if someone was helping you manage things." I said, "I understand." There was a pause. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm fine, sweetheart. Let me call you back in a few days." I could hear the relief in her voice. She thought I was going to comply. She thought I was going to fold. I want to tell you what I did next, because it happened fast, and the order matters. On a Monday morning, I listed the Myers Park house with a real estate agent I had worked with years ago, a woman named Carol, who had sold 3 of my commercial properties, and who I trusted completely. I told her I wanted a quiet sale, no public listing initially, just an approach to a few qualified buyers she knew. I told her I had a number in mind, and I needed to move within 60 days. She called me back on Wednesday with a buyer, a couple relocating from New York. They wanted the house. The offer was strong. We were under contract by Friday. On the following Monday, I called the attorney handling my estate documents and told him to finalize the transfer of the Lake Norman property, not to Renee, into a charitable remainder trust that Gerald and I had structured, which would provide income to me for the remainder of my life, and then direct the property and remaining assets to 3 organizations. Margaret had cared about deeply: a children's hospital, a literacy program, and a land conservation foundation that had protected open space in the county where she grew up. Margaret would have liked that. By the time Derek's attorney received notice from Gerald formally contesting the guardianship petition and providing the full documentation of my cognitive capacity, the Myers Park house was under contract, and the Lake Norman property had been legally transferred to the trust. The house Renee assumed would someday be hers no longer existed as something that could be hers. It was gone, properly, legally, permanently gone, placed in service of something that had nothing to do with acquisition and everything to do with what my wife had believed in. I was not in Charlotte when Derek and Renee found out. Paul had flown in from Denver, and I was with him. We were staying at a small inn in the Blue Ridge Mountains, in a town where Margaret and I had gone for our anniversary 3 times. I had not been back since she passed. Paul had suggested it, and I had agreed, and it was the right choice. The mountains in October in North Carolina are something that never gets old. I was sitting on the porch of the inn when my phone started ringing. Renee. I let it go to voicemail. Then Derek. Then Renee again. Then a number I didn't recognize, which was almost certainly Derek's attorney. Paul was sitting next to me. He looked at the phone and then looked at me. I said, "They found out." He said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it. The oak tree in the backyard of the Myers Park house. Margaret's hands in the dirt, placing a 6-inch sapling. The lake in the early morning when the water is so still it looks like a mirror. Renee, at 8 years old, learning to swim off that dock, shrieking every time the water hit her face. I said, "Sad. And sure, I did the right thing." Paul put his hand on my shoulder, and we sat there for a while. Let me tell you a few things about the aftermath, because I think they're important. Gerald filed our response to the guardianship petition, and it was denied. The judge reviewed the medical documentation, the character attestations, the financial records. The petition was dismissed. Derek's attorney did not appeal. There was nothing to appeal. The case had been built on the assumption that I would not fight back, or would not be able to. That assumption was wrong. The Myers Park house closed escrow 11 weeks after I listed it. I moved into a condominium I had purchased years ago as an investment property, which had been sitting under professional management. It's a beautiful place, smaller than the house, quieter, with a view of the city that I have come to love. I wake up early and make coffee and watch the sun come up over the skyline, and I think of Margaret. Paul came to help me move. We rented a truck and moved boxes for 2 days and ate takeout on the floor of the new place and talked until midnight about things we hadn't talked about in years. It was one of the best weekends I can remember. Renee left me a voicemail that was 12 minutes long. I listened to it once. Parts of it were angry. Parts of it were crying. Near the end, she said she didn't understand how I could have done this to her, how I could have thrown away the lake house, how I could have sold the family home without telling her. She said she felt betrayed. I have thought about this carefully, because I want to be honest and not dismissive. Renee's pain is real. Her grief over those properties, the associations she had with them, I don't doubt that those feelings are genuine. But there is a difference between grieving a loss and grieving the loss of something you believed you had a right to take. Renee was not grieving the home she grew up in. She was grieving the asset she had planned to control. I did not call her back that week. I wrote her a letter. In the letter, I told her that I loved her, that I had always loved her, and that I would continue to love her. I told her that I was aware of the guardianship petition and everything that had preceded it. I told her I did not write this letter in anger, but in clarity. I told her that what she and Derek had planned was a form of harm to me, to my autonomy, to the memory of her mother, who had worked alongside me to build everything they had tried to take. I told her that I had structured my estate to reflect my values, not their expectations, and that this would not change. I told her that if she wanted a relationship with me, I was open to that. But it would have to be a real relationship, built on honesty, not a transaction, not a management project, a relationship. I have not heard back from her yet. It has been almost 4 months. I don't know what she will decide. I hope she decides to reach back, but I have stopped making my peace contingent on her choice. Paul calls every Sunday. Last month, he drove down from Denver with his girlfriend, a woman named Sarah, who is warm and funny and clearly good for him. We went to a farmer's market on Saturday morning and had lunch at a place that makes its own pasta and sat outside in the fall air and laughed more than I had laughed in a long time. There's something I want to say to anyone who might be listening to this and finding pieces of their own life in it. I am not a man who enjoys conflict. I am not someone who takes pleasure in outcomes like this one. What happened was not a victory in any way that feels clean or satisfying. My daughter and I are estranged, and I carry that. What Derek did hurt me, not the legal maneuver, but the willingness to do it, and the fact that Renee was part of it. But here is what I know. The worst thing I could have done was pretend it wasn't happening. The worst thing would have been to smile and defer, and hope that things would somehow resolve themselves, while quietly losing ground. That is not how I built my business. It is not how Margaret and I built our life together. And it is not how I intend to live the years I have left. I am 67 years old. My health is good. I have a son I love and trust, and I have work still to do, and I have a view of the city in the mornings that takes my breath away a little, even still. I think about that oak tree sometimes, the one Margaret planted. I didn't take it with me when I sold the house, obviously. It stays with the property. It belongs to someone else, now a couple from New York with 2 children, who will presumably grow up with that tree in their backyard, not knowing anything about the woman who planted it or what it meant to her or to me. That's all right. The tree doesn't need to belong to me to have mattered. The things we plant don't always stay in our hands, but they stay. The morning I signed the final transfer papers, I sat in Gerald's office, and he slid the documents across his desk, and I looked at them for a moment before I picked up the pen. I thought about Derek's hands shaking with excitement when he handed me his folder. I thought about the folder going back across the table untouched. I thought about Renee's voice on the phone saying, "Are you okay?" I signed. Gerald said, "It's done." I said, "Yes, it is." And it was.